Most of you know this railroad as the Chesapeake and Ohio of Indiana, but that was not the original name of the line. It would start its life as the Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville Railroad. The Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville Railroad was the idea of William A. Bradford, Jr. of Boston, Massachusetts. A native of Virginia, Bradford attended the Virginia Military Institute for 1 year before beginning his railroad career as a clerk. Unfortunately, there are no known photographs of Bradford. By 1896, Bradford had risen to become the general manager of the Hutchison and Southern Railroad in Kansas. In 1897, he became the president of the Hutchison and Southern, which in 1900 he sold to the Santa Fe Railroad at what was apparently a handsome profit. Bradford, by the way, was a lifelong bachelor. Together with Henry A. Christie of Chicago, one of his associates in the Hutchison and Southern, Bradford conceived of a direct railroad line between Chicago and Cincinnati via Richmond, Muncie, Marion, and Peru in Indiana. Christie had since moved on to manufacturing bicycle components in Chicago, Illinois, and was familiar with the rail service in that area. The plan was to eventually connect the line from the west side of Cincinnati to Louisville, Kentucky, thus avoiding the substantial bottlenecks of Cincinnati's other railroad yards. As envisioned by Bradford and Christie, the line would be shorter than any existing railroad between Cincinnati and Chicago. However, the Pennsylvania Railroad already provided service to Marion, Muncie, Richmond, and Cincinnati, albeit with a more circuitous route. Thus, the CC&L could be considered a nuisance road, specifically to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The idea behind the nuisance road concept was that speculators would build rails located between two highly profitable and established locations, in this case Cincinnati to Chicago, at the cheapest possible price. The profitable railroad, in this case the Pennsylvania, would then feel compelled to buy out the new entrant, generally at a substantial premium to protect market share and maximize freight rates and passenger fares in absence of true competition. Now, in the early 1890s, it was generally considered that the national rail system, at least east of the Mississippi, was already overbuilt with many of the smaller roads already unable to pay dividends and service bonded debt. The larger players, the Pennsy, the New York Central, and the like, backed by big financial firms on Wall Street such as J.P. Morgan and Kuhn, Loeb and Company, were determined to rein in such unprofitable behavior. Thus, though somewhat late to the nuisance railroad game by this time, often were crushed by the concerted efforts of the large railroads and their Wall Street bankers. And now for a historical detour to explain the situation more fully. The Chicago, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh Railroad, essentially a front for the Pennsylvania Railroad, had previously acquired the Cincinnati, Richmond, and Chicago Railroad under what could be best described as blackmail conditions from the then financially strapped Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad in 1888, an event not uncommon of the era. The Cincinnati, Richmond, and Chicago line would eventually be merged into the Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, commonly known as the Panhandle Railroad, in 1890. Now, the Panhandle Railroad provided a direct but slightly longer route from the east side of Cincinnati via the Little Miami Railroad to Chicago, all under the control of the Pennsy. Thus, Bradford and Christie's Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville Railroad, as it would eventually be called, was a direct assault on the Pensy's lucrative line between Cincinnati and Chicago. But now, back to our story. The Cincinnati, Richmond, and Muncie Railroad was incorporated in 1900 by Bradford and Christie to build a new line to the named cities on the shortest possible route. The name of the road was chosen to hide the true ultimate destination. The Cincinnati, Richmond, and Muncie would in fact build a line from the Ohio state line to North Judson, Indiana. Two other companies were incorporated to carry out the construction. The company building the 45-mile line from the Mill Creek Valley from the west side of Cincinnati to Cottage Grove, Indiana, was incorporated in Ohio on March 7, 1902, as the Cincinnati and Indiana Western Railroad. In Cottage Grove, the road would cross and interchange with the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton-owned Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Western. The Chicago and Cincinnati Railroad was chartered on January 22, 1902, to build a line from North Judson, Indiana, to Chicago, Illinois. Upon meeting in Griffith, Indiana, in June 1904, Bradford and Christie were optimistic enough to begin plans to extend the line to Louisville, Kentucky, via Madison, Indiana. Thus, in 1904, the Cincinnati, Richmond, and Muncie, Cincinnati, Indiana, and Western, and the Cincinnati and Chicago Railroads were all merged by Bradford to form the Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville Railroad. Now, while the road did achieve the goal of the shortest route from Cincinnati to Chicago, it did not draw much traffic away from already established competitors. The route through South Fairmont, Westwood, Bridgetown, Dent, and Fernald in Hamilton County, Ohio, required navigating tortuous terrain. The rugged hillside along South Fairmont necessitated building a series of steep trestles. The resulting 1.9% grade through this area made moving freight traffic problematic, resulting in extra expenses of helper service and continual track maintenance. The long climb out of the Cincinnati Mill Creek Valley proved frustratingly difficult, as the CC&L then had to descend into and climb out of the Great Miami River Valley. These factors made the hapless railroad an easy target for others looking to expand their empire. Plans made to reach Louisville via the north bank of the Ohio River in Madison, Indiana, were never realized due to a lack of traffic and capital. The Cincinnati extension from Cottage Grove, Indiana, required two large bridges, one 480 feet in length over the Great Miami River at Fernald, Ohio, and the other a trestle of 680 feet over the Mill Creek Valley in Cincinnati. The latter, which became one of the most conspicuous parts of the Cincinnati landscape, carried the CC&L over tracks of several hostile railroads. The CC&L's first passenger train into Cincinnati terminated at a station at 8th and McLean Avenue on February 7, 1904. On the following day, Bradford moved the general offices of the CC&L from Richmond, Indiana, to the Carew Building in Cincinnati. However, the Chicago terminal arrangements were presenting problems. Bradford hoped to build into Hammond, Indiana, and then arrange an entrance over the Chicago Terminal Transfer Railroad into Grand Central Station at Wells and Harrison Streets in downtown Chicago. Either because of the hostility of the B&O or because of the CC&L's growing weakness, Bradford was unable to arrange the entrance. The financial panic of 1903 caused cash flow problems for the CC&L, resulting in the cancellation of an order of 5 Baldwin Atlantic steam engines, which it planned to use on the Chicago to Cincinnati passenger trains. At the same time, the CC&L was proving to be thoroughly unprofitable. In the fiscal year ending June 30, 1904, the company had revenues of only $391,000 and expenses of $853,000, incurring a deficit of $462,000. The line had little freight and passenger business, partly because of the lack of a Chicago terminal facilities and poor passenger facilities in Cincinnati. Enter the CH&D Syndicate, which acquired control of the weakened CC&L, but crucially failed to consummate ownership in July 1904. Bradford had recently become a member of the CH&D Syndicate and, according to accounts, desired to unload what was proving to be an ill-conceived and unprofitable railroad upon another party as quickly as possible. Bradford arranged for the transfer of $4.2 million of par value CC&L common stock, essentially worthless since the road was hopelessly unprofitable, to be sold to the CH&D syndicate for $3.5 million of par market bonds. Now, the CH&D syndicate controlled the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railway, the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Western, the Paramarquette Railroad, the Toledo Terminal Railway, and the CC&L under the banner of the Great Central System, although it was also known as the Great Central Route. The management of the CH&D syndicate, led by Eugene Zimmerman, would soon load the combined railroads of the Great Central System with enormous amounts of debt, with the syndicate paying themselves some tidy dividends before finding a willing and naive buyer for the entire lot in the Erie Railway via a deal brokered by none other than J.P. Morgan himself. There is some reason to believe that the operating executives of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton were less than enthusiastic about the CC&L acquisition. In fact, some members of the CH&D management and preferred stockholders threatened to sue to stop the deal. The Railway Age magazine reported that the CH&D had agreed to the acquisition of the CC&L only at the instigation of the Erie Railroad, which was already contemplating gaining control of the CH&D. Other contemporary accounts indicate that the Erie was the party displeased with the acquisition, claiming that the CC&L, quite correctly, was a money pit. When the Erie withdrew from the transaction to purchase the Great Central System in late 1905, the CH&D found itself with the prospect of acquiring a line for which it had little use, since it essentially duplicated the CH&D's and its subsidiary, the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Western's cooperative arrangement to Chicago via the Monon Railroad. Fortunately, the delayed transfer of the CC&L stock by Bradford to the CH&D syndicate spared the CC&L from the CH&D and Paramarquette's receiverships. As part of the overall fraud created by the CH&D syndicate, the CH&D and the Paramarquette would file for receivership in December 1905. The newly appointed board of directors of the CH&D would void the Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville purchase agreement in January 1906. Bradford, in turn, would sue J.P. Morgan, alleging that as a result of the failed merger, the Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville surrendered valuable franchises and subsidies for the projected line to Louisville and was enjoined from selling $3.5 million of Paramarquette bonds that was received as payment for the CC&L. Bradford would eventually receive $400,000 in settlement and a waiver of claims for $1.5 million of betterments made by the CH&D on his road and given rights to use certain CH&D facilities in Cincinnati. The now reprieved Chicago, Cincinnati, and Louisville, still losing money, pushed to Chicago and finally made arrangements with the Illinois Central, Wisconsin Central, and Grand Trunk railroads to use facilities at Central Station in Chicago. These roads, being essentially Western roads, had no incentive to block the CC&L. The first CC&L passenger train would leave Chicago for Cincinnati in April of 1907, but lacking membership in the Central Passenger Association, such traffic was minimal. The CC&L's principal financier, George A. Fernald and Company, made arrangements with the Wisconsin Central Railroad for iron ore traffic out of the Lake Superior fields via the CC&L to Cincinnati for connections to mills in Birmingham, Alabama, which was a rapidly growing steel center. In 1907, the CC&L would move its offices to the Ellsworth Building in Chicago, partly to be located closer to the Wisconsin Central. William Bradford, the CC&L's founder, would become president of the Wisconsin Central in 1907. For a while, things appeared to be picking up for the CC&L. Unfortunately, the financial panic of 1907 hit the CC&L hard, and declining revenues forced the CC&L itself to file for receivership in February 1908. The CC&L would remain in the hands of receiver James P. Goodrich for 2 years. Goodrich would sell the CC&L at a foreclosure auction in Richmond, Indiana, to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad on June 23, 1910. Given the road's financially dicey history, the Chesapeake and Ohio would elect to operate the CC&L as a separate subsidiary of the C&O as the C&O of Indiana until 1934, when, in the midst of the Great Depression, it would be merged into the parent company. Operation of the CC&L was integral to the C&O, but traffic density was always markedly below that of the main line east of Cincinnati. In the steam era, freight service was provided by mainly heavy Mikado locomotives. Bridge in the Cincinnati area would not support the 284s or other fast freight power until upgraded by the C&O in later years. The line was one of the first districts on the C&O to be dieselized starting in late 1950. The C&O of Indiana operated the line from the Mill Creek Valley in Cincinnati to Cheviot through Butler County, Ohio, to approximately Cottage Grove in Indiana as the Miami subdivision. At Cottage Grove, the C&O of Indiana crossed the former Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Western Line to Indianapolis, now owned by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The C&O acquired the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1962. The resulting line became the Chessie system, which later merged with the Seaboard system, taking the name of CSX. As part of the C&O B&O merger in 1962, the rail line that crosses the Great Miami River in Hamilton that proceeds on through Oxford to Indianapolis became the preferred route into Indiana for the combined roads. This made the Miami subdivision of the C&O of Indiana redundant and thus was abandoned around 1978 from the former Cincinnati Union Terminal Yard to the west bank of the Great Miami River. The remaining portions of the former C&O of Indiana, Miami subdivision, some 43 miles in length, remains intact from Fernald, Ohio to Richmond, Indiana. Much of the remaining C&O of Indiana line north of Richmond has been abandoned and removed. Between 1999 and 2005, as part of the Fernald nuclear plant cleanup administered by the U.S. Department of Energy, the remaining portions of the Miami subdivision was used to transport treated nuclear waste materials to storage sites in Texas, Utah, and Nevada. As part of that project, the rail lines and bridges were substantially upgraded. The CSX Railroad retains ownership of the line, but has leased the property since 2005 to the Indiana Eastern Railroad, a Class III short-line railroad, until 2029. I hope you enjoyed this video. Many thanks to those who have contributed information and photographs to this production, including George Hilton and Jim Blount, who have now passed on to the great train station in the sky. Dan Finfrock, Dave Orsey, and Chris Mayhew, who are thankfully still with us, and members of the Cincinnati Railroad Club, who have generously contributed photo collections and thoughtful comments on this production. Much of the information for this program came from the research done on my book, The Wreck of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railway, a railroad undone by greed and fraud, which is available from the Cincinnati Railroad Club online bookstore and the Butler County Historical Society.